For 8 decades, European security has been based on one thing: the assurance that if anything goes wrong, the US will be there to help, to lead, and to fight for it.
Today, on the NATO line, our military forces face east to prevent a possible invasion.
NATO has proven itself as the most successful alliance in history.
We've reaffirmed that our Article 5 commitment is sacred, and an attack on one is an attack on all, and we will defend every inch of NATO territory.
But since the beginning of 2025, that assurance is no longer really there.
If you're not going to pay, we're not going to defend. I said that 7 years ago.
The Donald Trump administration made it much less certain whether it would come to help Europe in need. And even before Donald Trump, Americans have been telling Europe that it's no longer a priority for almost 15 years. And so it's clear that regardless of whoever is in the White House in the future, Europe will have to mostly rely on itself. But can it actually do it? Could Europe defend itself without the United States if needed? I wanted to explore this in all its depth and complexity, and so I spoke with Ed Arnold, an expert on European security and defense, to talk about three big questions. First, what is currently missing or broken in European security that prevents Europe from being able to defend itself on its own? i.e., what's the problem? Second, what should be the blueprint of an ideal situation that we should aspire to? What's the goal? And third, what kinds of reforms and changes are needed for us to get there? And whether the reforms that we are seeing now are enough. In other words, what's the solution? Now, before we get to the conversation, if you care about geopolitics, and I assume you do since you're listening to this, you should really have a source that helps you filter all the noise from the stuff that actually matters. And that's what you get with my newsletter, Station Zero. In every edition, I break down 3 geopolitical stories that actually matter, but that most people fail to notice, and explain why they matter and what will be their impact. It's completely free, and you can find the link in the description. And a quick reminder that the corporate partner is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
I want to dedicate this to sort of a hypothetical exercise on the question of whether Europe could defend itself on its own. And for now, put aside whether it would need to do that, and just imagine that the US is not part of the picture anymore. And I think first I'd like to start by diagnosing the problem before we get to the solution and what needs to be done. First, it makes sense to talk about what's wrong and what's missing at the moment. And maybe a good way to bridge the theory and practice, because a lot of those things, the discussions about missing capabilities, it can sound very theoretical, would be to imagine another hypothetical scenario in which Europe was attacked and there would be a large-scale war in which Europe would have to defend itself, likely against Russia, and the US wasn't involved. If that was the case, what would Europe actually struggle with the most? What would be the biggest problem or biggest problems?
Well, I think in terms of a military issues, I mean, the two primarily, which would be the suppression of enemy air defense and also the destruction of enemy air defense, which the US have the majority of the current assets available to NATO. So if you sort of strip those back, then European states of NATO are going to struggle to then gain a superiority or a supremacy over the Russians, which NATO doctrine is effectively founded on in the sense that, you know, you own the air, then that gives freedom for your ground and naval forces to maneuver. So sort of the immediacy of that would be a weakness. And then, Europeans are gaining long-range strike capabilities. But again, that is something that the US has a lot more of, not just in terms of launchers, but also the ammunition. You can have as much launchers if you want. You can have as many artillery systems if you want. If you don't have the ammo, you can't use them. And that's to strike Russian deep targets. And the reason why that is so important is the Ukraine has shown that that is very effective. You don't have to target Russian gun lines. You can just target the logistics, the ammo dumps, the command and control, and that's sort of a way to neuter Russian offensive potential. So I think in the military realms, those two are the main considerations, certainly in the short term. But I think there's just the wider question of leadership, which is the issue that if you take the US away, then actually Europe led by a variety of peer states, so UK, France, Germany as the traditional ones, Poland and Italy probably next. And then as groupings, the Baltic states, although they're much smaller, and also the Nordic states as well. So within that, how do you actually organize and fight the battle in front of you with a slightly, either absent or distracted US and a Europe which is still not sort of quite on the same page? I think that's going to be a reasonably significant issue in the hypothetical scenario you're talking about.
I definitely want to talk about that and about the structural issues with how any kind of defense and how the fighting itself would actually be organized if the US wasn't in the picture. But if we stay on the military side of things, on the more technical side of things for now, apart from air defense and destroying enemies' air defense with long-range weapons, are there any other major gaps that you would think would really play a major role in a major conflict?
Yeah, I mean, but I think it's less that there's full gaps in other areas. It's just the European, what militaries call readiness, which are measured via a variety of ways, but essentially that's like, is a military formation ready to fight? And that is a significant issue on the European side, just because of the state of some of European armed forces. Most notably probably the Bundeswehr from Germany, which is on paper looks reasonably formidable, but when you actually go round to the sort of tank parks, kick the tires on vehicles, etc., you realize that actually a lot of European militaries effectively have to cannibalize kit. So yes, they have high readiness formations, like the tip of the spear. That's it. Don't talk about the rest of the spear, just talk about the tip. And you effectively have rotational forces there. So they're rotating through, but using the same equipment. So then suddenly when you actually have to equip a full army, that becomes far more challenging. And I think you see that in almost all European forces to a certain degree. That is improving, but it was from a very low baseline. So within that, in terms of combat capability, yes, the Europeans have some high readiness forces, but not enough. And then within those forces themselves, if you look at it from a sort of military functional level, again, there are deficiencies in other areas if you're comparing them to the US. So prime example, intelligence as well. Logistics is probably one of those significant enablers. The Americans have been pretty annoyed with Europeans over the course of the last 3 years in the war because they can actually move things from mainland US into Ukraine quicker than, say, France can get their equipment into Ukraine. So that's a significant blocker, considering that Europeans would have to put so many of their forces that are currently stationed in the West and reinforce over in the East. And again, that is a logistics constraint. You can't do much about that. There's programs in place to improve roads and bridges, etc., but you can't do that very quickly at all. And then I think just in sort of wider, again, we have, for example, in the UK, we have very sophisticated naval assets. We just don't have enough of them. So that is where we're heavily reliant on the US, not just in terms of quality, in terms of quantity. And again, those types of issues take time. The optimist in me, to this day, I'm still optimistic. There are pretty dramatic choices that then need to be made by Europeans to try and fix all of those things. And it has to be done very quickly. The issue is the track record of Europeans sort of trying to make these trade-offs and choices is not good because you still come against a bureaucratic layer, the sort of defense industrial layer as well, which makes this all very quite difficult and challenging, as it would as a coalition of 31 European members.
I want to get to the solution part a bit later on, but to stay on the problem for a bit longer, maybe to clarify it. So the better way to think about it is that it's not that Europe would be missing some specific important capabilities completely. It's that it has them, but overall it doesn't have as many of them, or nearly as many of them as would be necessary, because we do have air defense, we do have logistics, we do have intelligence, but it's just either not that good, or the capability is not developed enough, or there's not enough of it to suffice. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, it depends. I mean, I think the suffice is a completely different question, because that ultimately is reliant on how Russia would also fight, and that's a big constraint. I mean, we all thought that the Russians would fight very differently to what they did in 22, and they've got a lot of experience over the last 3 years, which you would assume that they would take on, though actually, in terms of how they fought in Georgia, for example, in 2008, we all assumed that they would be better 40 years later, and arguably they were actually worse. So I think it's difficult to sort of fully gauge that from a European standpoint. I mean, obviously the Americans generally have better kit and they have more of it. And also it's about the battle space management part, the sequencing element of it, the command and control. As an example, I mean, you need very good intelligence assets to find out your targets. If you can't find your target, you can't then strike it. So it's that sort of whole process of finding a target, fixing a target in place, and then potentially destroying it, or whatever you want to do, just to say a strike, then doing that over and over again, very, very quickly, to make sure that the Russians can't move assets out, etc. That's going to be a significant challenge. But also, actually, I think when you look at how NATO might fight, and also the force laydown, I mean, when you look at it on a map, there's 9 forward land forces from NATO, which are what we used to call enhanced forward presence, which is led by a NATO framework nation and its troops, and that's sort of the new hardened defense and deterrence posture within Europe. But all of those 9 separate, effectively, battle groups, they don't link together in any particular way. They almost completely independently. And actually, it's unlikely that a war with Russia would start like that. As an example, I mean, there's currently an FLF led by the French in Romania. I mean, for the Russians to really threaten Romania, I mean, it would either have to be maritime amphibious operation through the Black Sea, or they would have to go through the whole of Ukraine and then attack over the Carpathian Mountains. That's very unlikely to happen. That a troop build-up in towards the Suwalki Gap and Kaliningrad and the Baltic states is probably the most likely. So in that situation, actually, NATO can redeploy. They've got some lateral movement that they're able to do. So actually on the ground, I mean, there is an element of freedom in this, that actually those individual commands will just fight the Russians that are in front of them with the organic assets they have. And they actually could do quite a good job. The issue is about follow-on forces, reserves, and then that deep strike battle, which the Americans may still join in on, even if they don't have forces within Europe. And that's sort of the key sort of question at the moment from the current US administration's posture, that they seem to say that the Europeans need to do conventional defense and deterrence in Europe, or be prepared to do that. But actually the nuclear element still applies. So I think for Europeans, there's still a lot more unpicking to understand what the Americans are actually thinking in terms of Europe, because then that will give you your prioritization and your choices that I spoke about earlier.
Just a quick break here to let you know that the corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. Thank you, Conductor, for sponsoring this podcast. And now, back to the conversation. And I guess it's hard to plan for something if you don't know exactly what is it you're planning about, meaning that we likely know that the US would be less engaged, but we do not really know if they would not be engaged at all, or if it would be through some limited support in certain capabilities, which I assume makes the planning a lot harder.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, military missions plan on being given a mission to your higher echelon. So if you're not provided that, effectively the mission, and I think that this is the real challenge, which is what your sort of hypothetical scenario is ultimately getting down to, that we now have these new 3 regional plans, Northeast and South, which are the new plans, which are the most sort of comprehensive since the end of the Cold War. And now all of the US assets within those plans, I mean, is written in pencil instead of pen. And we need to now look at them to say, well, actually, where are these really critical gaps? Where are those assets that the US are likely to move towards the Indo-Pacific? So as an example, maritime patrol aircraft, they're effectively looks for Russian submarines in the North Atlantic and the North Sea, and the Arctic. So if they're going, well, we need to plug that as a gap. And there might also be some things that the Americans keep in. They might want to keep Patriot in, a defense system, because the Americans, I mean, they'll still have forces within Europe. It just might not be to the levels that sort of the Europeans would want. But even a small force of Americans is really important from a deterrence perspective, because Putin knows that if he were to accidentally or deliberately, for that matter, kill American soldiers, then it would be the catalyst for an American response, regardless of how Trump really wanted to play it. I think the domestic pressure would be pretty severe. And that's why Europeans want US military installations and as much military gear as they can on their soil. It's because of the Americans really provide the deterrence in the mind of Putin, less so the Europeans.
And I guess potentially you could also have some US forces in Europe in case of an attack, but the US could still decide not to participate in anything. For example, if they're withdrawn from the Baltics and the US keeps its bases in Italy and Germany and the UK, but not really in the frontline states, I guess that's a hypothetical as well.
I mean, it is a hypothetical, but also it's quite real, even on a sort of non-Trumpian understanding of the world as well. So Article 5 of the Washington Treaty is not, as it's described, an attack on one as an attack on all. It's much more nuanced than that, and it was deliberately written like that and agreed like that by the US government just after the Second World War, because they didn't want to be automatically committed to a further war in Europe. So actually, I mean, my understanding, and these things are open to interpretation, is effectively Article 5 is a consultative mechanism, as Article 4 is, but more serious, deemed an attack, and it says what an attack is covered in under Article 6. But it's to take whatever measures necessary up to and including armed force. So in a hypothetical scenario now, if part of Estonia is annexed by Russia in the next few months, and the Americans sent a single AWACS intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance plane, the US would be living up to the letter, if not the spirit, of Article 5 and the Washington Treaty. So actually Article 5 is far more vague and soft than other people would imagine. And I think that's because not a lot of people, not a lot of policymakers, not a lot of politicians have actually studied the Washington Treaty. And when you explain that to some people, they are a bit like, no, this means an attack on one, an attack on all. So it's considered. So again, as a real example of that, 2 years ago, a interceptor missile went over the border and killed to Polish farmers. So all I would argue is that when the UK delegation goes to the NAC to discuss what response potentially is this, you're going to the NAC with the consideration that actually that missile killed 2 farmers in Hampshire in the UK. What would you want doing about it? And that's what sort of your discussion would go into. And then also the fact that a war between NATO and Russia can happen without Article 5 ever being declared, or Article 5 is declared at a point in time which is not immediate. And again, that's something to sort of challenge. People just think that sort of escalation occurs very quickly, Article 5 is automatically declared, and then you get a war. If Russia was to attack Finland, Finland's not going to wait for the NAC. They're just going to fight. Swedes would probably join in, maybe the Estonians, and others would be dragged into what could be a limited regional war for a period of time before NATO potentially kicked in. So I think this is really important on sort of some of those hypothetical scenarios as well, as sort of challenge the assumption that, a Russian missile goes over the border or a Russian tank goes over the border, it automatically Article 5 is declared, and then you're in a large-scale war. That's not necessarily, it could happen like that, but it's not necessarily or the most likely scenario.
How big of a problem it would be, and you've already hinted at that, in case that, for example, in this hypothetical scenario, Russia would move in to annex part of Estonia, Europeans would declare Article 5 and would decide, okay, we have to fight. But the US would say, actually, we're not really sure. This is not really our problem, and we're going to sit this one out. And then how big of a problem would that be in terms of coordination and command if the Supreme Allied Commander, Europe, which is the chief of staff of NATO, basically, is and always will be an American, and a lot of other commanding positions within NATO in the joint command structures are also Americans, but then they might not be as engaged or at all engaged as the rest of Europe. How big of a problem would that be?
It would be a problem, absolutely. I think you highlight as well, it's not just the sort of the top of the stack in terms of Saka as a dual-hatted US and American officer. When you go around a lot of NATO commands, the intelligence, operation and planning functions are generally US or UK led. So it sort of filters all the way down the stack as well. And this is where sort of when you hear sort of news reports about the US maybe sort of moving away a little bit from the parts of the NATO command structure, for example, giving the Lusaka post to a European. In some ways, that actually might be beneficial for Europeans in the scenario that you are talking about. And I think it would be very difficult for the Europeans with the sort of, I think the worst case scenario would actually be just US still sort of occupying the positions within the command structure, but not taking them as seriously. That would be very difficult for the Europeans to deal with to an extent. And go back to my earlier sort of answer on this, that at the point that a potential war with Russia starts, we have deployed forces in areas under Article 3 of the North Atlantic Treaty in terms of your individual capacity to resist armed attack. You're going to fight. And the Europeans probably could do quite a lot without that. Not fully integrated command structure, but we have core headquarters, etc., which are European led. And from a NATO perspective, to an extent, it's also going to be best efforts. I don't think that NATO is going to fight as NATO thinks it's able to fight, because ultimately NATO hasn't been tested in this environment ever really as a single organizational entity. A lot of the fighting that NATO has conducted over the years, in Libya, Kosovo, Afghanistan, very, very different. So I think it would be unprecedented. But at the point where you have forward deployed forces, they're not just going to wait for orders. They're going to fight what they have in front of them. They also think it will probably be very quickly a large-scale war, so they're not going to worry about conserving ammunition. They're going to fight. They're going to fight properly. The issue is about getting the follow-on forces, the strategic reserve, and that's what the US are heavily reliant on, and also what is referred to as the transatlantic reinforcement plan. Now, in effect, that's not a separate plan. It's integrated into the regional plans. But you could probably, up to a couple of years ago, describe Nordic Baltic defense plans as fight until the Americans come. And the issue now is the sort of 2 points of failure on that, of whether the Americans come, i.e. the political order is given, and then also militarily how they would get there if they are also, focusing on another theatre, or from a military perspective that they're just, not in that sort of frame of mind in the sense of reinforcing Europe. I think that's a key consideration that Europeans need to worry about. And this is where I think we could be far better at sort of shaping our own destiny. Because again, for that transatlantic reinforcement from the US, if the order's given, it's not just the Americans doing it all, providing all of the security, providing all of the transport, providing all of the ships. The Europeans have a large stake in this because they ultimately want US reinforcements on their soil. And, for example, in the UK, to be able to track, target Russian submarines that are around the North Atlantic, trying to target ships, same with the planes, etc. For the Russians, why would you wait for the Americans to come over and meet up with their vehicles and sort of, form up in their brigade divisional formations? You target them as they're coming over the North Atlantic. So actually for the Europeans, there's a lot there that we can support the US. And I think we need to make it far more clear now within sort of this Trump administration that we're there to support. This isn't just us freeloading. It's not just the Americans having to do this on their own and sort of bail out the Europeans again, that we're in this together. It might ultimately not make a difference. I think the American administration view on Europe and European security is pretty settled, but I think it would be good for Europeans to try and make that sort of argument with the Trump administration and keep the Americans as engaged as possible, noting that there will be a lot of deprioritization.
You've mentioned that when it comes to deploying soldiers, a lot of you've given the example of the UK, but it applies to a lot of European countries where there is the tip of the spear that can be deployed quite fast and is ready, but then the rest of the spear might not really be there, or it would take a very long time for it to get ready. To what extent is part of that problem, or that problem is caused by the fact that European armed forces are basically very small in size? If you compare them with how large they were during the Cold War, both Eastern Europeans, but Western Europeans as well, they were several times larger than today. So it makes sense that they would run out of both soldiers and equipment very fast in case of a major conflict.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And also I think you have to dig into some detail as well to sort of find out where the real problems are. As an example with the UK, which is still a large army, not compared to what it used to be, but compared to sort of the European nations, of on paper strength 72,500, but actually the deployable strength is about 55,000. And that variance can be for a variety of reasons. It could be medically non-deployable, which could either be sort of a physical issue, broken leg or hearing impairment, etc., to a whole host of other reasons. But for whatever reason, you say 20,000 almost of the British Army are non-deployable. That's a significant amount when you're talking, and this is where, again, my earlier point about readiness. It's got nothing to do with sort of how many tanks you have on paper. It's about how many tanks can actually go into battle and be maintained. And this is where I think you get a lot of the variance. But for the Europeans and smaller nations, this is a huge issue. So let's take, the Danes or the Dutch as an example. I mean, for the Danes or the Dutch to lose a brigade in combat, not the full brigade, but, be declared combat ineffective. I mean, that's effectively taking out their armed forces. And, in large scale war, I mean, the Russians understand that the Russians don't fight like the Europeans do, and they are, less precious about casualties, etc. But they've been losing almost a battle group a day in terms of declared combat ineffective, either through killed in action or wounded action since August. We're recording this in April per day. That is significant, and that is an experience that no other European country has experience on. So for the Dutch, for example, to lose a brigade in combat, I mean, that's basically their army gone for a decade. That's a big issue for them, and also in terms of NATO, and also in terms of sort of public opinion, in terms of trying to hold potentially a fragile coalition together. I mean, it gets quite stark realities for the Europeans in terms of numbers when you're looking at it on recent precedents in terms of casualty rates from Ukraine and Russia, which both sides are struggling with. But to then extrapolate that onto a Western European nation, which is small, that's going to be a pretty big shock again if it does occur that way. And I think from a risk aversion perspective, that's going to be really quite difficult for politicians to manage as well going forward.
Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests.